Trying to encompass the Falkland Islands into a 2-hour presentation has been a formidable task, and much obviously has had to be left out. What we've tried to do is to cover the major events, and we have tried to tell the story as it unfolded with the information available to the task force at the time. This must inevitably preclude a great deal of the whys and the wherefores, the dilemmas at the time, and indeed a lot of the thought process that goes into planning such a campaign. We have kept it at fairly low level. Of course, you will hear of divisional, brigade, and battalion plans, but you will also hear of the realities found at company, platoon, and section level. We have endeavoured to bring in the human factor, perhaps the major factor in any armed conflict. When we get to the stage when Port Stanley is once again in British hands, we will then consider the arms and the services in isolation. All members of the presentation team took part in the campaign, and as they appear, I will introduce them to you. At times, you will hear of confusion, and indeed incidents which from hindsight were perhaps not very clever. However, the fog of war is something that actually has to be experienced, and things never go quite according to plan. For the purposes of this video recording, the presentation has been split into 4 parts. In the first part, we will briefly touch on the mounting of the operation and the passage to the South Atlantic. Now, I'm quite sure you all avidly follow the news media and are fully aware as to why HMG committed the force that it did to repossess the Falkland Islands, and the pressures, both political and financial, that the government brought to bear on the Argentines. For us, as soldiers, sailors, marines, and airmen, we had a just cause for which we were prepared to fight. And as one of my own Commissar Majors himself said, and you may have read the Observer colour supplement, Galtieri thought we were 8,000 miles away, and as a country, we hadn't shown a lot of interest in the Falklands. I reckon a lot of countries were watching to see what we were going to do. It was a much bigger situation than just the Falklands. Now, it was at 03:15 hours on the 2nd of April that 3-Commander Brigade was put on 72 hours' notice to move. Elements of the brigade were scattered all over the world. Most of the brigade staff and all Commando Second Commands and Quartermasters were in Denmark. Yankee Company of 4-5 Commando were in Hong Kong, and 4-2 Commando were on leave. For the next few days, unit lines were to become the scene of much frantic activity in the effort to get the brigade prepared for war. All vehicles were fully loaded, only to be unloaded again into shake-ons as a result of a severe lack of shipping space. Many sought-after stores, some on demand for over 7 years, miraculously arrived. Klansman equipment, supposedly still not off the production shelf, also appeared. Ask, and ye shall receive, seemed to be the cry. When the cupboard was bare, other units not involved in the operation came to the rescue. Now, there was no brigade operational plan at this stage, as the brigade commander had not yet been given his task. Simply, he'd been told to get his brigade on board ship and head south as soon as possible. Units were allocated to ships as the ships became available. The SS Canberra was to undergo extensive conversion for her war role, which included the construction of 2 flight decks. Some 3,000 tons of war maintenance reserve was loaded on the MV Elk. Small arms were zeroed, and finally, after 8 hectic days, the last 2 ships set sail. 3-Commander Brigade were now steaming south, albeit after a fairly haphazard loading program, as you can imagine. The normal brigade orbit is as you see here. This was supplemented by these units who sailed south with the brigade. And they were further supplemented by these units who were to join them at Ascension Island. This brief resume of getting the brigade launched does not do credit to all those concerned in the UK who were responsible for mounting the operation. It was a mammoth task, superbly performed, calling for flexibility and ingenuity of the highest degree, which was to continue for many weeks. Now, Captain Ian Gardner, who commanded X-Ray Company of 4-5 Commando, takes up the story of the passage south.
Whatever speculation may have been going on elsewhere during the negotiation phase, we could afford only one possible approach to our future. We were going to fight, and everything we did, all training, was devoted to that end. Facilities for training varied greatly between ships On the Canberra, for instance, one could run for miles unimpeded. She was a very comfortable ship, and even in the worst of weathers, training was very rarely seriously interrupted. On the LSLs, however, the Sir Lancelots and the Sir Galahads, space was severely limited, and in any kind of weather at all, the commonest form of physical exercise was the famous guardrail dash. But much very useful training was carried out on all ships. First aid, aircraft recognition, weapon handling, NBC lectures. We even managed tutes after a fashion. We also took the trouble to break open and issue the first line ammunition for a rifle section, and we dressed a section up in it as an exercise. And if you're an infantryman and you have never tried this, I most strongly recommend you do if you can. You will be surprised. It weighs a great deal, and not the least of the problems is where to pack it all. All was not work, though, and the crossing of the equator provided a useful occasion for people to misbehave themselves. King Neptune's court tried all and sundry who entered his domain. You see here the commanding officer of 4-5 Commando Royal Marines being charged with failing to get his commando on Easter leave. I need hardly add that we found him guilty, of course. The planning and loading for an amphibious exercise for the 3rd Commander Brigade Royal Marines would normally take several months. Such activity would usually take place with prior knowledge of the objectives and with a pretty clear idea of what form the exercise would take. We were privileged with no such refinements. In 6 days, the bulk of the brigade and its stores for war were loaded and sailed, and the confusion may only be imagined. At Ascension Island, a massive re-stowing effort took place, but even then, the nature of the forthcoming battle was far from clear. It may be of some interest to note that although it was politically necessary for us to sail in such a hurry from Great Britain, we could in fact have sailed 2 weeks later, having planned, trained, rehearsed, loaded our ships in a far more satisfactory manner, and still have landed on the 21st of May. Ascension Island also provided a useful training area, although being a tropical, precipitous, volcanic dustbin, it would have been difficult to actually find a place more dissimilar to that to which we're actually going. Much emphasis was placed on the zeroing of weapons, which of course is impossible at sea, and firing those with which we were less familiar, such as the 66mm anti-tank weapon. Information and intelligence was scarce, but from a standing start we got up flying speed remarkably quickly, and on the journey south from Ascension we were able to brief our people pretty fully with videos, slides, handouts on enemy aircraft, weapons, orbats, etc. While we knew there were a number of Argentinian Marines who were reputed to be well-trained, well-motivated troops, like you perhaps, we too heard of the alleged underaged conscripts with inadequate training. Well, however reassuring it may have been to hear of the inadequacies of one's prospective opponents, it was very difficult not to fall into the trap of underestimating or even dismissing one's enemy. And we went to considerable lengths to point out to our Marines that no matter how inadequate a training a man may have had, if even only one man was going to be prepared to sit behind a machine gun in a well-prepared, well-defended position, he was going to be quite dangerous enough. There was no shortage of information about the islands themselves. Having had detachments down there and in HMS Endurance for many years, the Royal Marines was littered with people who had served there. We were informed there would be a fair resemblance to Dartmoor or the Orkneys or the Western Isles, although it would be wetter underfoot than any of those places. There's not a tree or a road worth the name in the whole place, and because the air was extremely clear, everything would look closer than it actually is, which of course has a bearing on things like judging distance for artillery directions and on the spirits of men who are marching and can see their objective in the distance, and it never seems to get any closer. Apart from being boggy underfoot, the major obstacle to movement was going to be the stone runs. Now these were great rivers of boulders, quite unlike anything we would have ever come across before. Each stone could be up to 20 feet in width, and a stone run could be from 10 feet to over 1,000 meters across. The stones were covered in a lichen-type moss, which when wet, which of course they usually were, became very slippery, and they would often move when one stepped on them. And crossing these phenomena on a freezing night, where there was ice on the stones with a large pack on one's back, was an experience we were yet to enjoy. Vehicular movement across these stone runs, of course, was completely out of the question. It would be near midwinter when we landed. It was going to be cold, windy and wet, and so we were informed there would be no respite from it. In a day one could endure snow, rain, hail, sleet, and then rather like a dog in one of Pavlov's experiments, be completely illogically treated to a couple of hours of glorious sunshine. There was almost always a stiff wind, although opportunities to dry kit would be few and far between. Nevertheless, one certainly hardened to it, and by the time we'd cracked the 4-day exercise syndrome, and by the time 4-5 Commando had marched across the whole island, rather like wild animals, we almost preferred it out of doors. And we revelled in having acquired the skills to defeat anything that the country or the weather could present to us. And once one had worked out one's routines of drying one's socks inside one's jacket, hanging over one's woolly pulley, going around rather like a mobile Derby line, we reckon we could have gone on indefinitely.
During this passage south, the operation to capture South Georgia was underway. Captain Chris Brown of 148 Battery, who was a naval gunfire forward observer, now takes up the story.
While the main task force was heading south, a task group comprising the destroyer Antrim, the frigate Plymouth, and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Tidespring, having taken on board M Company of 4-2 Commando and Special Forces flown out to Ascension, headed towards South Georgia. HMS Conqueror carried out patrols ahead of us, and HMS Endurance joined up with the task group on the 14th of April and provided valuable intelligence on the terrain and the climate. But what we did not have at this stage was any hard intelligence on the enemy dispositions and strengths, and that was what was required before an assault plan could be made. To that end, SAS and SBS reconnaissance patrols were put ashore by helicopter on the 21st of April to report on the known enemy positions at Grytviken and Leith. A 100-mile-an-hour snowstorm that night forced the withdrawal of one of the patrols, during which 2 Wessex Mark V helicopters crashed, and the patrol and the crews of the Wessex had to be recovered by Antrim's Wessex Mark III. HMS Brilliant joined up with the task group on the 24th of April to give added protection against the submarine threat, and at this stage an attack plan had still not been finalised. Then, on the morning of the 25th of April, we detected the Argentine submarine Santa Fe on the surface off Grytviken, and the helicopters of Antrim, Endurance and Plymouth attacked with SS-12s and depth charges. At this stage, as you can imagine, there was considerable excitement on board ship. The submarine, damaged and unable to dive, limped back into Grytviken harbour. Anxious to keep this momentum going and to capitalise on the effect on the enemy's morale of seeing one of their submarines arrive crippled, the task group commander ordered the embarked force to go ashore and recapture Grytviken, despite the fact that Tidespring, with all the rifle troops of M Company of 4-2 Commando, was still too far away to take part because of the submarine threat. I was flown ashore by Endurance's Wasp 2 hours before HR to control the naval bombardment by Antrim and Plymouth. Having neutralised the landing site and the high ground that dominated it, I watched the landing force comprising SAS, SBS, a 2nd Naval Gunfire Forward Observation Team, and headquarters and support elements of M Company Group fly in. As they moved off the LS towards Grytviken, I switched the naval bombardment closer and closer to the British Antarctic Survey Base. The enemy now had front stall seats in a naval firepower demonstration. With the impending attack by the landing force, their demoralization was complete. A white flag was run up beside the Argentine flag, and as darkness fell, Grytviken was once again secure in British hands. Radio communications were then established with the enemy in Leith, who were invited to follow suit. Their initial reluctance mellowed that night at the thought of HMS Plymouth and an SAS troop poised to attack, and they surrendered at 0900 the next morning. We took a total of 185 prisoners, including the crew of the Santa Fe and the original scrap metal dealers, and M Company 42 Commando was subsequently stationed on South Georgia to protect the island during the remainder of Operation Corporate.
Throughout all these goings on, whilst the task force continued to move south, planning in earnest was taking place on HMS Fearless, with 3 Commando Brigade Headquarters staff and the staff of the Commodore Amphibious Warfare. Now, as a starter, the staff produced a joint appreciation of the situation in the Falkland Islands, leading up to a joint plan to cover the landings. Now, for those of you who've suffered the agonies of writing appreciations, I can assure you that the exercise was worthwhile. It ran no less into 46 pages plus 9 annexes, which I will not go through here. Interesting to note, though, that the plan decided on as a result of this appreciation was to use South Georgia as a secure base from which to mount selective raids, and at a future time to be decided on, to seize a bridgehead on the Falkland Islands themselves. Now, as you know, that was not the plan that was ultimately carried out. That doesn't, I believe, infer that the appreciation was wrong. At the time, with the information available to the task force, that was how the plan seemed to be falling out. Now, the staff produced no less than 8 plans for the landings. At this stage, of course, not enough was known about the enemy or his dispositions, and so every available option obviously had to be kept open. Hard, factual information about the enemy's strength and his dispositions was desperately needed, and this is where the Special Forces, in the form of D and G squadrons of the SAS, and the Special Boat Squadron, played a major and a vital role. Now, this was achieved by inserting a number of 4-man surveillance patrols some 3 weeks ahead of the main amphibious landing. They covered Port Stanley and the other major settlements, and the information which they subsequently sent back was invaluable and greatly assisted the brigade commander in making his plan. But whilst the brigade staff on HMS Fearless were heads down with sharpened pencils, the Royal Navy obviously had their part to play, and Commander Tim Yarker, who was on the staff of the Commodore Amphibious Warfare in the capacity of the Group Aviation Officer, now takes up the story.
It was never envisaged that a blockade mounted over 7,500 miles away from the United Kingdom would successfully defeat the Argentinians. Naval operations were therefore primarily designed to prepare for and ensure the safe passage of the amphibious force. To achieve this, we had to gain naval and air superiority, mount advanced force operations, and carry out interdiction by naval gunfire support and Sea Harrier strikes. You can see the size of the problem from the enemy orbat shown here. As a byproduct, a partial blockade was established, which brought important political and military dividends. But I must stress that it was never fully complete. At the very outset of the crisis, we sent the nuclear hunter-killer submarines, Spartan, Splendid, and Conqueror. And on the 12th of April, the government declared a maritime exclusion zone of radius 200 miles around the Falkland Islands to coincide with the arrival of the first of these. Next, we sailed an impressive surface task force from Gibraltar and the United Kingdom, which included the aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, with 20 Sea Harriers and 31 Sea Kings embarked. Commanded by Rear Admiral Woodward, it arrived off the Falkland Islands on the 30th of April, and on that day, the government declared a total exclusion zone. Once in the TZ, the Admiral's plan was to draw the enemy forces and to attack them on his own terms, and it was hoped to achieve this by the aggressive use of naval gunfire and Sea Harrier strikes, which I've already mentioned. It was also hoped that the sinking of either the cruiser General Belgrano or the aircraft carrier the 25th of May would knock the heart out of the Argentinian Navy. Action was joined on the 1st of May, which provoked the expected counterattacks. And by the 2nd of May, it became apparent that the enemy fleet was maneuvering to carry out a pincer attack on our carrier battle group, with the General Belgrano and escorts approaching the southern edge of the TZ, and the 25th of May swinging around to the north. Permission was sought and rapidly granted to attack the Belgrano, and she was subsequently sunk by 2 torpedoes from the submarine Conqueror. Her escorts were deliberately not attacked. However, after a brief and futile counterattack, they sped off at high speed, leaving the stricken cruiser to its fate. Argentinian response to the sinking was as predicted. The surface fleet never ventured out again, and we subsequently imposed a 12-mile limit on it. Again, this was never violated. Indeed, so frightened was our enemy destroyer of violating the limit, it ran aground instead. The submarine threat was not ignored either, and a long and complex anti-submarine action was carried out to the north of the TZ. This unfortunately proved inconclusive. However, our task force was never again menaced by enemy submarines. Events continued to move rapidly, and on the 4th of May, whilst the carrier battle group was steaming east away from the coast of the Falkland Islands, it was skillfully attacked by 2 super-étendard aircraft. Lack of early warning, poor visibility, and a certain measure of confusion meant that they penetrated our defences, and less than a minute after missile launch, HMS Sheffield was hit amidships in the engine room by an Exocet. Firefighting capacity was lost, and after 5 hours, with the danger of magazines exploding, the ship was abandoned. A grim determination swept the fleet, for we had been well and truly blooded. Part of the softening up plan involved the bombing of Port Stanley Airfield by Vulcans of the Royal Air Force. After prodigious feats of airmanship, 2 iron bomb and 2 Shrike anti-radar missile attacks were flown from the Ascension Island. It's a measure of the difficulty of airfield attack that despite these and Sea Harrier strikes, the Argentinian C-130s were still using the strip on the 14th of June. During the next 2 weeks, the task group was busy with Sea Harrier strikes and naval gunfire interdiction. Mounting of special force operations, the most spectacular of which, of course, was the raid on Pebble Island. The blockade was also tightened with the sinking of 8 patrol, auxiliary, and supply craft. Although the enemy air force had not been brought to major battle, the Argentinian Navy had been broken, and the ground troops incessantly harassed. The scene was now set for the arrival of the Amphibious force.
As 3 Commander Brigade were heading south, 5 Brigade, under command of Brigadier Tony Wilson, was put on standby. Initially, we were on 48 hours warning, which was then put back to the normal 7 days. But as a result of this, none of the tons of weapons, clothing, and equipment could be released to battalions. And consequently, equipment was still arriving as the men boarded the buses en route for the QE2 at Southampton. 2 and 3 Para, who had sailed with the 3 Commander Brigade, were replaced in the Orbat by the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards and my own battalion, the 1st Battalion Welsh Guards. The lack of field and air defence artillery, army helicopters and logistic units were made up by units of 1 brigade. Now the brigade assembled at Sennybridge on April 21st for a fortnight's intensive training, only partially equipped with clansmen. It was still not clear until the final day of our training, May the 2nd, whether in fact the brigade would be required to go or not. This slide shows our Orbat. The following week saw intensive activity, with equipment still arriving, staff lists being prepared for the umpteenth time, and ferries being loaded for, quote, an administrative landing, unquote. On the 12th of May, we sailed on the QE2, stopping at Freetown for water and only passing close enough to Ascension Island to take on General Jeremy Moore and his staff and some other odds and sods. Consequently, there was no time to rehearse, cross-check vital stores, or generally sort ourselves out, as we've been given the option of doing. Like the Commander Brigade, we trained intensively in all corners of the ship on our way south, and this included, in fact, training out .5 machine guns, and our only familiarity with the weapon was a textbook which arrived the day we sailed, and in fact, the United States Air Mines only joined us at Ascension Island. At this stage, plans were firming up for the initial landings, and Commander Tim Yarker will now tell you of the naval considerations.
These considerations were complex. Not only had the landing force to be got safely ashore, but its air defense had to be provided for, and its long-term support assured. This meant that the site for the landings would have to provide a sheltered anchorage, safe from the prevailing winds, sufficiently landlocked to make missile attack impossible, and offering a measure of protection against conventional air attack. It also had to have a safe passage from seaward. San Carlos Water offered all these, and also met the military requirements. Unfortunately, as with all things, it had its drawbacks. The approaches were easily mined, but more importantly, the closeness of the West Falkland Islands degraded the naval radars and weapons systems. However, I must stress that it was the only really possible site. Common sense dictated that only one major unit should be carried in any one ship, and this was achieved with a certain amount of cross-decking to the north of the TEZ on the 19th of May. It provided a safer disposition, but resulted in the landing ships HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid being at overload conditions, with subsequent inconvenience and discomfort to the embarked forces. To ensure surprise, the initial landings were to be at night by landing craft, totally silent, with the helicopter offload commencing at first light. This meant a daylight transit through part of the TEZ, but atrocious weather screened the force from prying eyes. The ships then steamed down Falkland Sound in 3 waves, whilst the destroyer, HMS Glamorgan, made a feint to the south of Stanley. They anchored at San Carlos, where Fearless and Intrepid launched their landing craft, and the invasion was underway. On their way to San Carlos, the amphibious ships were escorted by a strong force of destroyers and frigates. Initially, these were to provide anti-submarine protection, anti-surface protection, and naval gunfire support. But more importantly, and absolutely crucially, they were to provide close anti-aircraft protection, which you will hear about in Part 2.